You know that feeling when your phone lights up with their name and your heart does that thing? That twisted gymnastics routine between terror and relief? Yeah, that's not love. That's your brain betraying you in the most exquisite way possible. And here's the part that'll make you uncomfortable. You're not weak. You're not stupid. You're just human. Horrifyingly, predictably human. Let me tell you about something that happened in a laboratory in the 1950s. Something so disturbing that it changed everything we thought we knew about love. Harry Harlow, a psychologist with more curiosity than mercy, took baby rhesus monkeys away from their mothers, but he didn't just separate them. He built 2 artificial mothers. One was made of wire, cold and angular, but it had a bottle that fed the babies. The other was covered in soft cloth, warm to the touch but offered nothing. No food, no sustenance, just comfort. Which mother do you think the babies chose? If you said the one with food, you'd be wrong. The infant monkeys clung to the cloth mother desperately, obsessively, leaving only to quickly feed from the wire one before scrambling back to the softness. Even when Harlow modified the experiment and made the cloth mother eject sharp spikes that stabbed the babies, even when she blew compressed air so forcefully it threw them across the cage, those babies kept coming back, bleeding, traumatized. They would wait, trembling, until the abuse stopped, then crawl right back into her arms. Does that sound familiar? Should it? Because here's what Harlow discovered, what he documented with clinical precision in journals that are now considered both groundbreaking and ethically horrifying. Attachment doesn't require kindness. It doesn't even require safety. Attachment requires only intermittent contact during a critical period of vulnerability. And you, right now, reading this, you're still in that critical period. You've always been in it. Your brain doesn't distinguish much between the monkey clinging to the spiked mother and you checking your ex's Instagram at 3 a.m. The neural pathways are almost identical. Let me introduce you to something called trauma bonding. It's not in the DSM as a standalone diagnosis, but every therapist worth their degree knows it by heart. It's the psychological phenomenon where victims form powerful emotional attachments to their abusers, not despite the abuse, because of it. Patrick Carnes, who spent decades researching this, found that trauma bonds are actually stronger than positive attachments. Read that again. The connection forged through pain, through cycles of abuse and reconciliation, through betrayal and desperate making up, creates neural pathways more resistant, more persistent, more devastatingly powerful than healthy love ever could. Why? Because your brain on abuse is your brain on drugs, literally. When they hurt you, your cortisol spikes, your body floods with stress hormones, your nervous system screams danger. You exist in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the next blow, the next insult, the next silent treatment. Your baseline becomes anxiety. And then when they're nice, when they apologize, when they touch you gently and tell you they didn't mean it, your brain doesn't just feel relief, it experiences a neurochemical explosion. Dopamine, oxytocin, serotinoids flooding your system like a tidal wave. That contrast, that violent swing from pain to pleasure, from terror to safety, that creates an addiction more powerful than cocaine. I'm not being metaphorical. Studies using fMRI scans show that people in abusive relationships experience brain activation patterns in the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, identical to those of gambling addicts and drug users. You're not choosing to stay. You're chasing a high that only they can provide, because only they create the lows that make the highs possible. It's called intermittent reinforcement, and it's the most effective conditioning tool ever discovered. B.F. Skinner proved it with rats. He put them in boxes with levers. One group got a food pellet every time they pressed the lever. They pressed it when hungry, then stopped. Boring, predictable. The second group got food randomly. Sometimes 5 presses, sometimes 50, sometimes nothing for minutes. Those rats developed obsessive compulsive lever pressing behaviors. They couldn't stop. They pressed until their paws bled. They pressed in their sleep. The unpredictability had hijacked their reward system completely. Your abuser isn't pressing your levers. You're the rat, and every kind word after cruelty, every gentle touch after violence, every promise after betrayal is a random pellet. And you can't stop pressing. Lenore Walker documented this in her cycle of violence theory in the late 70s. She interviewed thousands of abuse survivors and found an almost universal pattern. Tension building, acute explosion, reconciliation, and calm, then back to tension. That honeymoon phase, that reconciliation period where they're the person you fell in love with again, that's not the real them. But it's not fake either. That's the pellet. That's the cloth mother between the spikes. That's the chemical hit that keeps you bound more effectively than chains. And here's the really disturbing part. The part that might make you close this video. You probably learned this pattern before you could walk. John Bowlby's attachment theory, expanded by Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiments, showed that children develop attachment styles based on their earliest relationships. If your caregiver was inconsistent, if love came with conditions, if affection was weaponized or withheld as punishment, your brain wired itself to understand that this is what love looks like. Chaos, uncertainty, pain followed by relief. Children in Ainsworth's studies who had unpredictable mothers developed what's called anxious ambivalent attachment. As adults, they became the people who stayed, the ones who kept trying, the ones who believed that if they could just be better, quieter, more perfect, the love would be consistent. The spikes would stop. They never do. The spikes never stop, because the spikes are the point. But here's what nobody tells you in those pastel-colored therapy offices, what gets buried under all the self-help advice about boundaries and self-love. Understanding why you stay doesn't automatically give you the power to leave. Knowledge isn't freedom. Sometimes it's just a better view of your cage. And the cage? It's built from the inside. Let me tell you about Stockholm 1973, a bank robbery that would give a name to something humans had been experiencing since we first formed pair bonds. Jan-Erik Olsen walked into Sveriges Creditbanken with a machine gun and took 4 hostages. For 6 days, those people were held captive in a vault. They were threatened. They were used as human shields. They believed they would die. And then something inexplicable happened. The hostages began to defend their captor. They refused rescue attempts. One woman became engaged to Olsen. Another set up a legal defense fund for him after his capture. Psychologists scrambled to explain it, settling on the term Stockholm Syndrome. But here's what they missed. This wasn't a syndrome. This wasn't pathology. This was adaptation. This was survival. Your nervous system, that ancient reptilian core of your brain, doesn't care about your dignity. It cares about keeping you alive. And if the person who threatens you is also the only person who can save you, your brain makes a simple calculation. Befriend them. Love them. Become indispensable to them. Because if they love you back, maybe they won't kill you. Niels Bierroth, the psychiatrist who coined the term, observed that these bonding patterns emerge not from weakness, but from the specific conditions of captivity, perceived threat to survival, small kindnesses from the captor, isolation from other perspectives, and perceived inability to escape. Now, read that list again and tell me it doesn't describe your last relationship, the one you swore you'd never go back to, the one whose number you've deleted 17 times. Threats don't have to be physical to trigger survival mode. Financial control is a threat. Emotional manipulation is a threat. The silent treatment that makes you feel like you're disappearing is a threat. And those small kindnesses, the morning they brought you coffee just the way you like it after screaming at you the night before, that's the captor giving you water. That's intermittent reinforcement dressed up as love. Donald Dutton, who spent 30 years studying abusive personalities, found that abusers aren't monsters. They're not inhuman. They're cyclically abusive, which is so much worse because it means they're also cyclically wonderful. His research showed that men who abused their partners often experienced childhood trauma themselves, witnessed violence, learned that love and pain were inseparable. They don't abuse you in spite of loving you. They abuse you because that's what love looks like in their neural architecture. And your brain, desperate for pattern recognition, for predictability, learns their rhythm. You become fluent in their violence. You can feel the tension building before they can. You know when to be small, when to be comforting, when to disappear. You develop a sixth sense for their moods. That's not intuition. That's hypervigilance. That's your amygdala working overtime, burning through resources, keeping you in a constant state of threat assessment. Lisa Aronson-Fontes documented this in her work on invisible chains. She found that victims often can't articulate why they can't leave because the barriers aren't visible. There are no locked doors, no physical restraints, just a web of psychological manipulation so intricate that you can't tell anymore where you end and they begin. Gaslighting makes you doubt your perception. Isolation cuts off alternative narratives. Financial abuse removes practical options. And beneath it all, that voice that sounds like theirs but comes from inside your own head now, whispering that you're too damaged for anyone else to love, that you're lucky they stay, that you provoked them, that you're the problem. Here's a study that'll haunt you. Researchers at University College London scanned the brains of people in controlling relationships. They found actual structural changes. The gray matter in regions associated with decision-making and self-awareness had decreased, measurably. The abuse had physically altered their brains. You didn't imagine it getting harder to think clearly. Your capacity for autonomous decision-making was literally shrinking. But wait, there's more, and it gets worse. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the Bible on trauma, found that the body keeps the score even when the mind tries to forget. Your nervous system remembers every incident, stores them in implicit memory in the tissues, in the way you flinch at raised voices, in the way your stomach drops at certain tones. You're not overreacting. You're having a physiological response to stored trauma. And here's the cruel joke. That same stored trauma is what keeps you bonded. Because each time you think about leaving, your body remembers the times you tried before. The rage, the pleading, the threats, the promises. Your nervous system floods you with anxiety at the thought of abandoning them, not because you don't want to leave, but because it remembers what happened last time you tried. It's protecting you from their reaction by keeping you compliant. Your fear of their pain response has become indistinguishable from love. Psychologist Albert Biderman studied prisoners of war and identified 8 techniques used to break human beings: isolation, monopolization of perception, induced debility, threats, occasional indulgences, demonstrating omnipotence, degradation, and enforcing trivial demands. Amnesty International adopted this as their model for understanding torture. Every single technique appears in abusive relationships. Every single one. You're not in a relationship. You're in a hostage situation with better furniture, and the most disturbing research. It comes from neuroscientist Lucy Brown, who studied the brains of people who'd been rejected by romantic partners. The pain centers that lit up, the same ones that activate during cocaine withdrawal, same ones that drive addicts to relapse even when they know it'll destroy them. You're not weak-willed. You're in withdrawal. Your brain is screaming for the drug, and the drug's name happens to be the person who's destroying you. So when people ask why you don't just leave, when they say they'd never put up with that, when they judge you for going back the 5th time, the 10th time, the 100th time, remember this: they're not stronger than you. They just haven't been conditioned by the perfect storm of intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, neurochemical addiction, survival adaptations, and potentially decades of attachment wiring that taught them this is what love costs. But here's the question that should terrify you more than anything else I've said. What if you're not trying to fix them? What if you're trying to fix the past? Sigmund Freud called it repetition compulsion. Carl Jung called it the shadow's attempt at integration. Modern neuroscience calls it maladaptive pattern recognition. But it all points to the same disturbing truth. You don't keep choosing abusive partners randomly. You're hunting for the original wound so you can heal it retroactively. And it never, ever works. Peter Levine's research on somatic experiencing reveals that unresolved trauma creates a loop. Your nervous system gets stuck in the moment of threat, perpetually braced for impact, and it seeks out familiar scenarios to finally achieve a different outcome. That father who never approved of you, you'll find his emotional unavailability in a partner and convince yourself that if you can just make this one love you, it'll rewrite history. That mother whose affection came with conditions, you'll recreate her impossible standards in someone new and destroy yourself trying to finally be good enough. You're not falling in love. You're falling into a time machine aimed at your childhood, and the destination is always the same: the moment you learned that love hurts. Harville Hendrix documented this in his imago relationship theory. He found that we're unconsciously attracted to partners who embody the negative traits of our primary caregivers, not the positive ones, the negative ones. Because your psyche believes, with the logic of a traumatized child, that if you can get this person who has all the same flaws to finally love you properly, you'll retroactively heal the original damage. It's brilliant. It's hopeful. It's completely fucking doomed. Because the 28-year-old version of your emotionally unavailable father isn't going to suddenly become capable of vulnerability just because you've perfected yourself into an anxiety-ridden people-pleaser. The partner who withholds affection isn't going to fill the void your mother left. They can't. They're not archaeologists. They're just people with their own traumas, their own compulsions, their own rats pressing levers in their own minds. And here's where it gets really dark. Francine Shapiro's work on EMDR revealed that trauma doesn't store linearly. Your brain files the emotional intensity of childhood abandonment right next to yesterday's argument. The memory of being 5 years old and terrified that daddy's anger meant you were unlovable sits in the same neural folder as your partner's contempt last Thursday. So when you're fighting to save the relationship, you're not just fighting for them. You're fighting for every version of yourself that was ever left, ever rejected, ever deemed unworthy. You're fighting for the child you were. And children don't give up on their parents. They can't. Survival won't let them. The ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, surveyed over 17,000 people. What they found changed everything. Childhood trauma didn't just affect people psychologically. It affected them physically, decades later. Adults who'd experienced abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction had exponentially higher rates of heart disease, cancer, depression, and suicide attempts. But here's the connection. They also had exponentially higher rates of entering and staying in abusive relationships. Trauma begets trauma. Pain seeks pain, not because you're broken, but because you're trying to master what once mastered you. Judith Herman, in her groundbreaking work on complex PTSD, observed that captivity creates a bond that can persist even after physical escape. The captor occupies psychological space long after they're gone. Their voice becomes your inner voice. Their criticism becomes your self-talk. Their control becomes your habits. You've internalized them so completely that leaving their physical presence doesn't mean freedom. It means taking them with you, a hostile passenger in your own mind. And when you're alone, when you finally built up the courage to block their number, to pack your things, to start over, that voice gets louder. It tells you nobody else will understand you like they did. It reminds you of the good times. It rewrites history, airbrushing out the bruises, the screaming, the nights you cried yourself into exhaustion. It makes you nostalgic for your own abuse. That's not love. That's Stockholm Syndrome, having a conversation with your repetition compulsion while your trauma bonding nods along. Sue Johnson's work on attachment injuries and emotionally focused therapy shows that the antidote isn't just leaving. It's rewiring. It's creating new neural pathways through safe, consistent, boring love. The kind where nobody's yelling, where affection doesn't come with invoices, where you're allowed to have boundaries without being punished. But here's the catch. That kind of love will feel wrong. It'll feel empty. Your nervous system, trained on the high-stakes drama of abuse cycles, will interpret safety as boredom. stability as lack of passion, kindness as weakness or manipulation, you'll self-sabotage. You'll pick fights, you'll create chaos because chaos feels like home and home feels like love and love feels like survival. Psychologist Shirley Glass found that many people who finally escape abuse don't end up with healthy partners next. They end up alone because the work of rewiring is so uncomfortable, so counterintuitive, so painfully slow that it feels easier to just opt out entirely. And maybe that's not failure, maybe that's wisdom, maybe choosing solitude over repeating the pattern is the first real choice you've made in years. Because here's what all of this research, all of these case studies, all of these brain scans and surveys and decades of psychological investigation ultimately reveals. You're not damaged goods, you're not too broken to be loved, you're just caught in a loop that evolution designed for entirely different threats. Your attachment system evolved in an environment where abandonment meant death, where pleasing the caregiver was survival, where love and fear were inseparable, because the person who could kill you was the same person who kept you alive. It was adaptive then, it's maladaptive now. But knowing that doesn't automatically break the cycle. You can understand the neuroscience of trauma bonding and still feel your heart race when their name appears on your screen. You can recognize intermittent reinforcement and still crave the high of reconciliation. You can see the pattern clearly and still walk back into it because the alternative, true autonomy and self-reliance, requires building a relationship with the one person you've spent your entire life abandoning, yourself. And that person, the one staring back at you in the mirror, might be the most terrifying attachment of all. Because they know everything, every compromise, every time you betrayed your own boundaries, every moment you chose their comfort over your safety. That relationship, that's the one that needs healing. But it's also the one you can't leave. So maybe the real question isn't why you keep going back to people who hurt you. Maybe it's why going back feels safer than staying with yourself. And what would it mean to finally choose differently? The cage isn't locked from the outside. It never was. The door's been open this entire time. You're just terrified of what's waiting on the other side. Not them. You. The version of you that exists without the drama, without the chaos, without the excuse that you're too busy surviving someone else's damage to face your own. That version? She's patient. He's been waiting. They know you'll find them eventually. When the pain of staying finally exceeds the fear of leaving, when you're ready to press a different lever, when the cloth mother stops being worth the spikes. But until then, every time you pick up that phone, every time you respond to that text, every time you convince yourself this time will be different, remember, you're not choosing them. You're choosing the familiar torture of repetition over the unfamiliar terror of transformation. And both are forms of suffering. You just get to decide which one comes with the possibility of ending.